Mim. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Washington, D.C., as the city's elites settled into their routines of business meetings and social engagements. Nestled on a cobblestone street, a small, upscale restaurant bustled with quiet activity. Known for its exclusivity and impeccable service, the establishment was a haven for influential individuals seeking discretion and luxury. Its high ceilings, dimly lit ambiance, and tastefully arranged tables reflected its reputation as a place where deals were sealed over fine wine and gourmet cuisine. Rachel arrived promptly at 6:00 p.m., her figure framed in the doorway as she adjusted the strap of her leather handbag. Poised, confident, and dressed in a tailored navy pantsuit that complemented her dark skin, she exuded professionalism. Rachel was a rising star in the corporate world, a senior consultant known for her expertise in solving high-stakes problems for Fortune 500 companies. As she walked to the hostess stand, her polished demeanor turned heads, but Rachel remained focused. She had reserved a table for a business meeting with a potential client, a powerful executive who was running late. The hostess, a young woman with a polite smile, directed Rachel to a window-side table, one of the restaurant's most coveted spots. Seated discreetly in the far corner of the restaurant, Barron Trump dined quietly with his security detail at an adjacent table. Dressed in a casual yet impeccably tailored outfit, the teenager had grown into a tall, striking young man, his presence understated yet commanding. Despite his low public profile, Barron had inherited his family's ability to draw attention, though he seemed to prefer blending into the background. Meanwhile, Steve, a middle-aged waiter with salt and pepper hair and a pinched expression, noticed Rachel's arrival. His gaze lingered on her a second too long, betraying a discomfort he didn't bother to mask. Unlike the other staff members who moved efficiently through the dining room, Steve's steps slowed as he approached her table. Rachel adjusted her blazer and placed her phone on the table, scanning the menu with practiced ease. She was accustomed to high-pressure situations where every move and every word was scrutinized. But as Steve approached, there was a shift in the air, an unspoken tension that Rachel had encountered too many times before. Steve cleared his throat, avoiding eye contact. "Good evening," he said, his tone lacking the warmth he had displayed at other tables. "Are you waiting for someone?" "Yes," Rachel replied, her voice polite but firm. "I have a reservation, and my guest will be joining me shortly." Steve hesitated, his eyes flicking over her attire and then back to the hostess stand. "I see. Well, I'm afraid there might have been a mix-up with the reservation. This table is reserved for other guests." Rachel raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor intact. "That's unlikely," she said. "I confirmed the reservation myself earlier today. Perhaps you could check again?" Steve's expression tightened. "It's just that we have certain policies regarding our clientele. I'm not sure this is the right place for you." The words landed like a punch, though Rachel's face betrayed no sign of hurt or shock. She had faced subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination throughout her life, but the sting never lessened. Nearby diners began to notice the exchange, and whispers rippled through the room. "What kind of policies are you referring to?" Rachel asked, her tone steady but pointed. Steve shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just saying, maybe there's another place you'd feel more comfortable." A murmur of unease spread among the diners. Barron Trump, seated at his table, glanced up from his meal. His sharp blue eyes followed the exchange, his expression unreadable, but attentive. Rachel took a deep breath, placing her menu down on the table. She straightened in her seat, exuding the quiet confidence of someone who had fought many battles and emerged stronger each time. Her voice, though soft, carried a firmness that demanded attention. "Let me be clear," she began, her gaze locking onto Steve's. "I have a confirmed reservation at this restaurant, just like everyone else here. I'm not leaving simply because you're uncomfortable serving me." Steve's face reddened, but Rachel didn't give him a chance to interrupt. "I understand my rights as a paying customer, and I also understand that your actions right now are discriminatory. I'm not sure if you realize how serious that is." Rachel paused, her eyes scanning the room. She could see the curious stares of other patrons and the barely concealed shock on the faces of some staff members. But no one spoke up. The silence was deafening, yet Rachel was undeterred. "You see," she continued, I didn't get to where I am today by allowing people to treat me as if I don't belong. I'm a senior consultant at one of the top firms in the country, and I've been to restaurants far more exclusive than this one. Her tone was measured, each word carefully chosen. But this isn't about my credentials. This is about the fact that I have every right to be here, just like everyone else in this room. Steve crossed his arms, his demeanor shifting from discomfort to defensiveness. Look, he said, his voice rising slightly, I'm just doing my job. I don't make the rules here. Maybe you should try another place where you'd feel more welcome. Rachel's jaw tightened, but her expression remained composed. Around her, she could feel the weight of the other diners' gazes, their silence speaking volumes. Some looked away, clearly uncomfortable, while others watched with a morbid curiosity. I see, Rachel said, her voice colder now. And I suppose you think treating me differently because of how I look is part of your job too? Steve opened his mouth to respond, but the tension in the room had become suffocating. Whispers grew louder as patrons exchanged glances, though still, no one spoke up. The manager was conspicuously absent, leaving the situation to fester. Steve leaned closer, his tone lowering but retaining its condescension. You don't have to make this a big deal, ma'am. I'm sure there are other restaurants you'd enjoy more. The remark drew a sharp intake of breath from a nearby table. Rachel folded her hands on the table, her movements deliberate and controlled. You've already made this a big deal, she said quietly. But if you're unwilling to do your job, perhaps I should speak to someone who can. From his corner of the restaurant, Barron Trump had been quietly observing the interaction. His security detail exchanged concerned glances, clearly sensing his growing unease. At just 18, Barron was no stranger to public scrutiny, but he had largely stayed out of the spotlight. Tonight, however, something in Rachel's calm defiance struck a chord in him. Barron pushed back his chair and stood, his tall frame commanding attention. The subtle scrape of his chair against the floor drew the eyes of everyone in the room. Without a word, he began walking toward Rachel's table, his expression resolute. The silence in the restaurant deepened, and even Steve froze, his confidence faltering as Barron approached. Rachel looked up, momentarily confused by the young man's sudden involvement. Excuse me, Barron said, his voice steady but firm. Is there a problem here? Steve stammered, caught off guard. It's nothing, really, just a misunderstanding. Barron raised an eyebrow, his tone sharpening. It doesn't look like nothing to me, and from what I've heard, this woman is being treated unfairly. He gestured toward Rachel, who remained silent, her eyes fixed on Barron with cautious curiosity. Steve opened his mouth to respond, but Barron continued. I don't know what your issue is, but it's unacceptable. She has every right to be here, and I think you owe her an apology. The boldness of Barron's statement left the room in stunned silence. Even Rachel, who had faced countless challenges with unwavering resolve, was momentarily speechless. As Barron's words hung in the air, the tide in the room began to shift. The room was silent, save for the faint clink of cutlery from a distant table, where a patron, oblivious to the unfolding drama, continued their meal. All eyes turned to Barron Trump, who stood tall and composed. Despite his youth, there was a gravity to his presence that demanded attention. As he approached Rachel's table, his gaze remained fixed on Steve, the waiter who had just moments ago seemed so confident in his condescension. Rachel looked up at Barron, her expression a mix of surprise and cautious curiosity. While she had no idea who he was, the quiet strength he exuded gave her an odd sense of reassurance. For the first time since the encounter began, Steve seemed visibly shaken. He shifted nervously, his earlier bravado crumbling under Barron's steady gaze. I'm sorry, but I don't understand what's happening here, Barron said, his voice calm yet firm. Why isn't this woman being served? Steve stammered, struggling to find words. I was just explaining that we have certain policies. Policies? Barron interrupted, his tone sharpening. I'd love to hear what kind of policy allows you to treat someone differently based on how they look. The words, though spoken softly, cut through the tension in the room like a knife. Steve flushed, his discomfort now palpable. He opened his mouth to respond, but Barron didn't give him the chance. This woman has a confirmed reservation, Barron continued, gesturing toward Rachel. She's dressed appropriately, She's polite, and from what I can see, she's done absolutely nothing to deserve this treatment. So I'll ask again, what exactly is the problem? Steve's eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but found none. The other diners, who had been passive observers until now, looked on with a mixture of approval and curiosity. The room's energy had shifted dramatically, and the power dynamic had flipped entirely. Rachel, sensing the change, decided to speak. "I appreciate you stepping in," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "But I think it's clear what's going on here." She turned to Steve, her gaze steady. "This isn't about policies, is it? It's about prejudice." Barron nodded slightly, his expression hardening. "If that's the case," he said, addressing Steve directly, "then you're not just embarrassing yourself, you're embarrassing this entire establishment." Steve's face turned beet red, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out in frustration. But he quickly realized the futility of the situation. Barron's composure, combined with Rachel's quiet strength, left him with no room to maneuver. Steve took a step back, his confidence entirely eroded. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact with both Rachel and Barron. "That's not good enough," Barron replied, his tone unwavering. "An apology isn't just about words. It's about understanding the harm you've caused and making an effort to change." Steve's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. The silence in the room was broken by the sound of someone clearing their throat. It was the restaurant manager, a tall man in a crisp suit who had finally emerged from the back. His expression was a mix of concern and embarrassment as he hurried to Rachel's table. "Ma'am, I deeply apologize for what has happened here," the manager said, his voice earnest. "This is not the kind of experience we want for our guests. Please allow me to personally take over your service for the evening." Rachel's expression softened slightly, but she remained guarded. "I appreciate that," she said, "but what about him?" She gestured toward Steve, who now stood awkwardly to the side. "What's being done to ensure this doesn't happen again?" The manager turned to Steve, his jaw tightening. "I'll be addressing this matter with him directly," he said firmly. "But for now, I think it's best if he steps away from the floor." Steve opened his mouth to protest, but thought better of it. With a muttered, "Fine," he turned and walked briskly toward the kitchen, his shoulders hunched in defeat. As the manager turned back to Rachel, Barron spoke again. "I'm glad you're taking action," he said, his tone measured. "But I hope you understand that this isn't just about one incident. It's about creating a space where everyone feels respected, regardless of who they are." The manager nodded, his expression serious. "You're absolutely right, sir. We'll be reviewing our policies and conducting additional training to ensure this never happens again." As Steve disappeared into the back, the room seemed to exhale collectively. The tension that had gripped the restaurant for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a new energy, one of solidarity and support. A middle-aged woman at a nearby table turned to Rachel. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said, her voice filled with genuine regret. "You handled it with such grace." Another diner, a man in a suit who had been silent until now, nodded in agreement. "It was wrong, plain and simple. I'm glad someone finally stood up and said something." Others began chiming in, their voices growing louder and more confident. "Thank you for speaking out," one woman said to Barron. "It's refreshing to see someone so young take a stand." A young couple near the back of the room held up their glasses. "To respect and equality," the man said, prompting a small wave of applause from the other diners. Rachel, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of support, allowed herself a small smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but warm. "It means a lot to hear that." Barron, still standing beside her table, acknowledged the applause with a nod, but quickly redirected the attention back to Rachel. "She's the one who deserves the credit," he said. "She stood her ground long before I got involved." But the applause grew louder, and Rachel couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. While the experience had been painful, it was clear that something meaningful had come out of it. As the applause died down, the manager stepped forward again, addressing the room. "I want to thank all of you for your patience," he said. "I also want to assure you that we take these matters very seriously. The actions of one employee do not reflect the values of this establishment." He turned to Rachel. "Your meal tonight is on the house," he said, his tone earnest. "It's the least we can do to make up for what happened." Rachel nodded politely. "Thank you," she said. "But what I really want is to know that no one else will have to go through this." The manager met her gaze. "You have my word," he said. "We're committed to making this right." After the manager had apologized profusely, the offending waiter had been removed, and the room began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Barron remained at Rachel's table. While most of the diners resumed their meals, casting the occasional glance toward the duo, a few lingered, their attention still caught by the quiet yet impactful exchange that had just unfolded. Barron stood there for a moment, his tall frame slightly imposing, but his demeanor gentle and thoughtful. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, not wanting to diminish the gravity of what had transpired. "Yeah, but you shouldn't have had to fight this battle alone," he said quietly, his voice steady, but filled with a sincerity that transcended his years. Rachel, seated with her hands resting on the table, looked up at him. Her expression softened as her eyes searched his face, noting the earnestness in his tone. "Sometimes it feels like I always have to," she admitted, her voice calm but tinged with a weariness that only someone who had endured such struggles could understand. Barron's brow furrowed slightly, the weight of her words hitting him harder than he had expected. He thought about the privilege he carried, how his name and position often shielded him from situations like this, and how Rachel's reality was one he could never fully grasp. Yet here she was, composed and resilient, her dignity intact despite the blatant injustice she had just endured. He extended his hand, his movement deliberate and steady. "Not tonight," he said firmly, "and hopefully, not again." Rachel hesitated for the briefest of moments, not out of reluctance, but as if to absorb the weight of his gesture. Then she reached out and shook his hand. The gesture, simple yet profound, seemed to hold an unspoken agreement between them, a shared commitment to something larger than themselves. "Thank you," Rachel said, her voice carrying a quiet strength, "for standing up when it mattered." Barron smiled faintly, his grip firm but not overpowering. "It's the least I could do," he replied. "No one should have to face that alone." For a moment, the world outside the restaurant seemed to fade away. The bustling city streets, the distant hum of cars, and even the whispers of other diners all seemed to dissolve in the gravity of their exchange. It was a moment that transcended age, background, and circumstance, united by a shared understanding of justice and humanity. As Barron released her hand, he stepped back slightly, his posture still attentive. "If there's anything else I can do," he added, his tone sincere, "don't hesitate to let me know." Rachel nodded, her gratitude evident, not just in her words, but in the way she held herself, a faint smile breaking through the solemnity of the moment. "You've done more than enough," she said, "but what you've done tonight, it matters, and not just to me." Barron glanced around the room, noticing how the energy had shifted. Patrons who had initially stayed silent now seemed emboldened, their expressions reflecting a newfound resolve. The staff moved with a quiet determination, the earlier tension replaced by a sense of collective purpose. Even the manager, who had returned to ensure Rachel's comfort, appeared humbled, his demeanor more thoughtful and measured. Before Barron returned to his table, he glanced at Rachel one last time. "I hope the rest of your evening goes better," he said, offering a faint but genuine smile. "It already has," Rachel replied, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. As Barron walked back to his seat, the room seemed to exhale collectively, the earlier tension replaced by an air of quiet admiration. While Barron resumed his meal, his security detail keeping a watchful eye, Rachel sat at her table reflecting on what had just transpired. For once, she felt not just seen but truly supported, a rare and deeply meaningful experience. The evening had started with a confrontation born of ignorance, but it had ended with a powerful reminder that empathy and courage, no matter how quietly displayed, could change the trajectory of a moment, and perhaps even inspire something greater. The following day, a diner who had witnessed the incident uploaded a video of the interaction to social media. The video, captioned, "When standing up for what's right makes all the difference, #stand with Rachel," quickly began circulating online. Within hours, it went viral, resonating with people across the world. The footage captured Rachel's calm strength, Steve's discriminatory behavior, and Barron Trump's poised intervention, sparking a widespread conversation about allyship, respect, and equality. The video ignited debates on social media with hashtags like Stand with Rachel and Sean Leadership in Action trending globally. People applauded Rachel's grace and resilience in the face of blatant prejudice. Her calm yet assertive demeanor struck a chord with viewers, many of whom shared their own experiences with discrimination. Equally, Barron's actions were widely praised for their maturity and courage. The sight of a young man standing up against injustice inspired hope in an audience that spanned generations and backgrounds. News outlets quickly picked on the story, broadcasting the video alongside headlines like, Barron Trump takes a stand for justice, and restaurant incident sparks national conversation on equality. The narrative captured hearts because it was both personal and universal. A moment of adversity turned into an example of how empathy and action can create change. Analysts and commentators emphasized the importance of what Barron had done, highlighting the power of privilege when wielded responsibly and courageously. Rachel, initially hesitant to embrace the attention, recognized the opportunity to advocate for broader change. In interviews, she shared her perspective, expressing gratitude for the support, but also emphasizing the systemic issues underlying moments like this. She encouraged viewers to move beyond applause and examine how they could contribute to creating more inclusive environments in their daily lives. This isn't just about me, Rachel explained in one widely shared interview. This is about every person who has been made to feel like they don't belong. It's about ensuring that spaces like this restaurant and every other space reflect respect and equality. Her words became a rallying cry, inspiring individuals and organizations to take actionable steps toward addressing discrimination. Barron, on the other hand, chose to remain relatively quiet in the aftermath of the incident. When approached by reporters, he issued a brief statement that simply read, "We all have a responsibility to treat each other with respect. I did what I thought was right, and I hope it encourages others to do the same." While his response was understated, his actions spoke louder than any words could have. His decision to intervene inspired young people across the globe, sparking a wave of reflections on what it means to be an ally and how even small acts of bravery can create lasting impacts. The restaurant itself faced public scrutiny. While many applauded the manager's swift response and apology to Rachel, others questioned why the incident had occurred in the first place. The restaurant released a public statement committing to anti-discrimination training for all staff and emphasizing that the behavior displayed by Steve was unacceptable and not reflective of their values. Though some remained skeptical, others viewed the steps as a necessary move toward progress. The ripple effects of the incident extended far beyond the restaurant. Educators used the video as a teaching moment, encouraging students to discuss the importance of allyship and how they might respond in similar situations. Community leaders organized events and conversations centered on fostering inclusivity and confronting bias. Stories began to surface of individuals inspired by Barron and Rachel to stand up in their own lives, whether it was defending a classmate from bullying, addressing unfair treatment at work, or speaking out against injustice in public spaces. The video's reach grew even broader when a well-known filmmaker announced plans to create a documentary based on the incident, titled Standing Up, Small Actions, Big Changes. The project aimed to explore the deeper implications of what had happened and how moments like these could inspire meaningful change. The film received critical acclaim upon its release and further cemented the story's legacy. Months later, Rachel reflected on the experience in a speech at a diversity and inclusion summit. "What happened that night was painful, but it also showed me something beautiful," she said. "It showed me that even in the face of ignorance, there are people willing to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.' It reminded me that kindness and courage aren't just ideals. They're actions we can all take, every single day." Her words resonated deeply, drawing a standing ovation from the audience. Barron, meanwhile, returned to his quiet life, but his name continued to be associated with the values he had demonstrated so publicly. Parents spoke of him as a role model, someone who had shown that true leadership requires empathy and action. A high school teacher shared how her students, inspired by Barron's intervention, had started a campaign in their community to combat prejudice and celebrate diversity. The incident also left a lasting impression on the diners who had witnessed it firsthand. Many admitted that they had hesitated to speak up in the moment, but vowed to act differently if faced with similar situations in the future. One diner remarked in an interview, "Seeing that young man stand up the way he did made me realize how much more I could be doing. Silence isn't neutral, it's part of the problem." As time passed, the story of Rachel and Barron became more than just a viral video. It became a symbol of the power of small actions to inspire widespread change. What had started as an uncomfortable moment in a small restaurant turned into a global reminder that standing up for what's right, no matter how small the gesture may seem, can have a profound impact. It reaffirmed the idea that bravery doesn't require grand gestures or titles. Sometimes it's as simple as speaking out when it matters most.